She almost didn't stop. That's the part Clara Cindy would replay for years. The half-second where her feet kept moving, her head down, her breath fogging in the January cold. She was running late. She was always running late after a double shift. The park was just a shortcut. The snow was just background noise. But then she heard it. Not a scream. Something worse than a scream, a small, broken sound, like a voice that had already given up on being heard. Her head snapped left. And there, half swallowed by the frozen stone fountain at the center of Meridian Park, was a boy. His fingers, small, pale at the tips, were the only things keeping him above the waterline. His dark jacket had turned black with ice water. His lips were the color that made every nerve in Clara's body fire at once, because she had seen that color before. In emergency rooms. In the back of ambulances. That color meant she had maybe minutes. Hey, hey. She was already running, her medical bag swinging off her shoulder, her boots punching through the snow. Hold on. I've got you. I've got you. She didn't think about who he was. She didn't think about the black SUVs idling at the park's east entrance that she'd barely registered walking in. She didn't think about the two figures standing very, very still beneath the bare oak trees, watching, but not moving. Not helping. She thought about his lips. She thought about his pulse. She thought about getting him warm. That was the only thing Clara Cindy knew how to be. The person who ran toward the thing everyone else froze in front of. She would later learn that the boy's name was Seoha. She would later learn that he had not fallen into that fountain by accident. She would later learn that the men beneath the trees weren't bystanders, they were guards. And their boss, a man named Kim Minute, was already being called. But in this moment, in the snow, with Seoha's weight against her chest and her hands working fast and sure, Clara knew none of that. She just knew the boy was alive. And she was going to keep him that way. Medium dark skin tone waving hand sign before we begin. If you're new here, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss a chapter. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I genuinely want to say hello to every single one of you. Now let's get into it. The cafe was called Blue Elm, and it was the kind of place that smelled like burnt espresso and old wood. Warm in the way that only a room full of strangers pressed close together against the cold could be. Clara shoved the door open with her shoulder, Seoha half draped across her arms, his body a dead, shivering weight that told her everything she needed to know about how little time she had. I need a table, she said to no one and everyone at once. Now. Clear it. Nobody argued with the woman in blue scrubs soaked through with melted snow and absolute determination. A young couple scrambled from a corner booth and Clara laid Seoha down across the bench seat, already unzipping her medical bag with one hand while pressing two fingers to his neck with the other. Pulse. Weak. Rapid. There. She worked fast, the way she always worked, with her mouth slightly open and her eyes scanning and cataloging all at once. Hypothermia. Possibly early stage. His core temperature had to come up slowly, carefully, or she risked sending his heart into shock. She called for warm towels, not hot. She elevated his legs. She talked to him, low and steady, even though his eyes kept sliding shut. Stay with me, baby. I've got you. You're not going anywhere tonight. He didn't answer. But his fingers, those small, pale-tipped fingers, curled slightly, like he was trying to hold on to the sound of her voice. She had been working on him for perhaps 4 minutes when the door opened and the temperature in the room dropped even before the cold air rushed in. There were 3 of them. Large men in dark coats, earpieces visible, moving through the cafe the way water moves around stone, every other person in the room instinctively pressing back, clearing a path without being told to. The one at the front stopped beside the booth and looked down at Seoha, then at Clara, with the flat, neutral expression of someone who had been trained to show nothing. We'll take it from here, he said. Not a request. Not even really a sentence. more like a door being shut in her face. Clara didn't look up from Seoha's wrist, where she was monitoring his pulse. "You'll stand there and be quiet," she said, "or you'll step outside and be quiet. Those are your two options." The man blinked. It was clearly not the response the earpiece had prepared him for. His lips are still blue. She did look up then, briefly, and there was nothing soft in her expression. "That child is in active hypothermic distress. If you move him right now, you will kill him. So whatever your instructions are, they can wait 8 minutes. Now step back." The man looked at his colleagues. Something passed between them, a decision made at a level above their pay grade, communicated without words, and they stepped back. Clara exhaled once through her nose and kept working. By the time Seoha's color had begun to inch back toward something living, she was aware that the cafe had gone very, very quiet. Not the natural quiet of people absorbed in their own conversations. The kind of quiet that happens when something large and dangerous enters a room. She heard the footsteps before she saw him. Slow. Measured. The walk of a man who had never once had to hurry for anyone. He was tall. That was the first thing, taller than she'd expected, taller than the doorframe seemed to want to allow, and yet he moved through the space without touching anything, without disturbing anything, as though the room simply rearranged itself ahead of him. Sharp jaw. Dark eyes that were not unkind but were absolutely, unmistakably cold. He wore a black coat that probably cost more than Clara's monthly rent, and he carried nothing, no bag, no phone visible, no weapon she could see, and somehow that made him more intimidating, not less. Kim Minute stopped at the edge of the booth. He looked at his son first. Something moved behind his eyes, something quick and deep, like a stone dropped into still water, and then it was gone, sealed back beneath the surface. Then he looked at Clara. She looked back. She had been looked at by attending physicians who thought she was beneath them, by patients' families who blamed her for things beyond anyone's control, by men in hospital corridors who thought a woman in scrubs was someone they could dismiss. She had learned, over 12 years of nursing, how to hold a gaze without flinching. She held his now. "You pulled him from the fountain," he said. His English was flawless and slightly formal, every syllable placed like a chess piece. "Yes." "You kept my men from moving him." "Yes." A pause. He studied her the way she imagined he studied everything, thoroughly, without hurry, calculating value and risk simultaneously. "Your name?" "Clara Cindy." She kept her hand on Seoha's wrist. "And you are?" One of the men in dark coats made a sound. Kim Minute raised 2 fingers, barely, and the man fell silent. "Kim Minute," he said simply, as though that were enough. As though the name itself were a weather system, something you didn't need to explain. You simply acknowledged it and adjusted accordingly. Clara nodded once. "His temperature is stabilizing. He needs to be kept warm and monitored for the next 2 to 3 hours, minimum. He should not be moved aggressively. He needs fluids, and he needs to be somewhere quiet." Kim Min's jaw tightened. "I have people." "I'm sure you do." Clara began carefully rewrapping Seoha's hands in the dry cloth the barista had brought her. "But right now, the person he has is me. And I'm not finished." She expected anger. She had been preparing for it, actually, had already calculated the fastest path to the cafe's back exit, had noted that the barista behind the counter had a phone in her hand and was clearly debating whether to dial someone. Clara had faced angry fathers before. Angry fathers with power and money and the kind of quiet fury that came from never being told no. What she did not expect was for Kim Minute to pull out the chair across from the booth and sit down. He sat the way he moved, with absolute economy, no wasted gesture, and he folded his hands on the table and watched her work. Not impatiently. Not with the performative calm of a man suppressing rage. With something that looked, unexpectedly, like genuine attention. "You're a nurse," he said. "I see you. 12 years. You carry a full medical kit in your bag. I have a habit of being in the room when things go wrong." She checked Seoha's pupils with a small penlight. "Equal. Reactive. Good. I stopped apologizing for it a long time ago." Another silence. Seoha stirred slightly, a small sound escaping him, and Clara immediately placed her hand flat against his cheek, gentle, warm, instinctive. The boy settled. Kim Minute watched that small exchange with an expression she couldn't fully read. "How long," he said quietly, "before he can be moved?" "Safely? Another hour here, minimum. Then he needs to go somewhere warm, ground floor, easy access. No stairs." She glanced up. "No drafts." Kim Minute nodded slowly. And then, in a tone that had clearly never once in his life been used for requests, he said, "Will you come with him?" Clara looked at him for a long moment. "That depends," she said, "on whether I'm being asked or instructed." Something shifted at the edge of his mouth. Not quite a smile. More like the shadow of one, there and gone. "Asked," he said. She held his gaze for 3 more seconds, measuring, deciding, and then she looked back at Seoha, who had begun breathing more evenly now, color creeping back into his small face like dawn coming in slow. "Then yes," she said. "I'll come." The building had no name on the outside. Just a number, pressed in brushed steel above a set of black glass doors that opened inward as the car pulled up, as though the building already knew they were coming. Which, Clara realized, it probably did. The lobby was marble and shadow and the kind of silence that money builds deliberately. The elevator had no buttons, or rather, it had one, and it required a key that Kim Minute produced without looking. They rode up without speaking, Seoha bundled in Clara's coat now on top of his own, his head resting against her shoulder in the kind of unconscious trust that children offered before they had learned to be cautious about it. The penthouse was, she searched for the right word and landed on architectural. Beautiful the way a photograph of a glacier was beautiful. Vast, precise, cold. Stone floors the color of winter sky. Furniture that looked chosen more for geometry than comfort. Floor-to-ceiling windows that showed the city spreading out below them like a map of everything Kim Minute apparently owned. But no drawings on the refrigerator. No small shoes by the door. No crayon marks on the walls or books left open on the floor or any of the small, beautiful disasters that children left behind them like breadcrumbs. Nothing, anywhere, that said a child lived here. Clara stood in the center of that great, gray room and felt something tighten in her chest that had nothing to do with the cold. A woman appeared, older, Korean, with the efficient manner of someone who had run households that required discretion, and Kim Minute spoke to her quietly in Korean. The woman looked at Clara once, assessed her in about 2 seconds flat, and gave a small nod that felt like a passing grade. "Mrs. Yoon will show you to a room," Kim Minute said. "For Seoha." And, a brief pause that he covered smoothly, "For yourself, if you're willing to stay through the night." Clara looked down at the boy asleep against her shoulder. "Show me the room," she said. Seoha didn't speak much. She noticed that on the second day. Not in the way of a shy child who needed time. She knew that silence, had seen it plenty. This was something different. Something practiced. He waited to be spoken to before he spoke. He sat where he was placed and did not reach for anything, did not ask for anything, did not express preference for anything. When she brought him a glass of orange juice and a glass of water and asked which he'd like, he looked at them both for a moment and then looked at her, as though waiting to be told what the correct answer was. Clara set both glasses down in front of him. "You can have both," she said. "Or neither. Or one. Whatever you want, baby. There's no wrong answer." He stared at her. Then, slowly, with the careful deliberation of someone diffusing something, He reached for the orange juice. She smiled at him. He looked faintly alarmed by this, which told her everything she needed to know. She began small. She brought crayons the third morning, not a coloring book, just blank paper, because a coloring book told you what to draw and she wanted to see what he chose when nobody told him. He drew a house with a very large door and 2 windows, and she did not ask him what it meant. She just said, "I like the door," and he looked at the paper for a long time and then, quietly, added a small figure standing in the doorway. She didn't push. She just showed up. Every day, at the same time, with the same steady warmth, until one afternoon she arrived to find him sitting at the edge of the kitchen island with his homework spread out in front of him. And he looked up when she came in and said, carefully, experimentally, "Clara, I couldn't do number 7. It was 9 words. It was everything." She pulled up a stool beside him and leaned over the worksheet and said, "Okay, let's look at number 7, and she did not make it a big moment, because she understood instinctively that naming it would scare it back into hiding. But that night, in the elevator going down, she pressed her back against the wall and exhaled slowly and thought about a little boy who had to learn that wanting things was allowed. And she made a decision, quiet and absolute, that she was going to stay until he knew it all the way down to his bones. Kim Minute found her in the kitchen on a Thursday evening, standing at the stove making jollof rice because Seoha had, in a moment of stunning bravery, said it smelled good once when she mentioned it. Mrs. Yoon had the night off. The penthouse was quieter than usual. He stood in the doorway for a moment. She heard him, or felt him, the particular quality of stillness he carried, and then he came and stood on the other side of the island without being invited and without excusing himself, which she was beginning to understand was simply how he existed in spaces. "He smiled today," he said. "At the window. Watching the pigeons." Clara stirred the pot. "I know. I saw." A long pause. "I haven't seen that since," he stopped. Started again. Differently. "It has been a long time." She turned the heat down slightly and turned to look at him. He was leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, and he looked, not diminished, exactly, but like a man who had set something very heavy down for just a moment and wasn't sure whether to pick it back up. "His mother," she said. Not a question. He nodded once. "Jian. 3 years ago." His jaw moved. "Seoha has her eyes. The same shape. Sometimes when I walk into a room and he looks at me, I see her looking back, and He stopped. Pressed his mouth together. I began avoiding the room." Clara was quiet for a moment. The rice was starting to steam gently. "You punished him," she said, carefully, without accusation, for surviving her. The words landed hard. She watched them land, watched him absorb them, not with anger, but with the particular stricken look of someone hearing a truth they had already half known and had hoped to keep half unknown. "Yes," he said finally. Barely audible. "You didn't mean to," she said. "But yes." She turned back to the stove. "His not her. His also not the reason she's gone. His just a boy who lost his mother and then lost his father to grief, and has been sitting very quietly in this beautiful, empty apartment trying to be small enough not to cause any more pain." The kitchen held the silence carefully. "How do I fix it?" Kim Minute said, and it was the first time she had heard his voice stripped of its authority, raw at the edges, genuinely asking. Clara thought about that for a moment. "Start by staying in the room," she said. Medium dark skin tone clapping hand sign hey. Pause for a second. If you're feeling this story, like this video and subscribe so you get every chapter. And I really want to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. I read every single one. It started with Thursdays. Kim Minute had a standing thing on Thursday evenings, meetings, calls, arrangements that required his physical presence somewhere that was never discussed openly. But in the 3rd week of February, a Thursday came and went and he didn't leave. Clara noticed it the way she noticed most things, quietly and without comment, and simply set 3 plates instead of 2. Seoha noticed it too. She saw the careful, sideways glance the boy gave his father, the held breath, the waiting, and then Kim Minute sat down at the kitchen island and said, "What are we eating?" in the tone of someone making a genuine inquiry, and Seoha said, very quietly, "Clara made soup," and that was that. By the 4th Thursday, Kim Minute was learning her coffee order. She found this out because Mrs. Yoon handed her a cup one morning with a look that said volumes without saying anything, and it was her exact order, the complicated one that she'd only ever made herself in this kitchen: oat milk, no sugar, a half shot of something that was not quite espresso. She looked at the cup and then looked up, and Kim Minute was already walking away down the corridor, coat on, briefcase in hand, and he did not turn around. She stood there holding the cup and felt something shift in the architecture of the situation she was living inside. He began appearing in doorways. Not intrusively, always at a respectful distance, always with something else apparently requiring his attention. But she would be in the middle of helping Seoha build something out of those magnetic tiles she'd brought, and she would become aware of him standing in the hallway, watching. Not her. Exactly. Watching the two of them together. Watching his son laugh, which Seoha was doing with increasing frequency now, a little startled each time by the sound of it, like he kept forgetting his own face knew how. On a Thursday in early March, she arrived to find Seoha at the piano, an enormous, beautiful instrument she had assumed was decoration, picking out notes carefully, looking frustrated. Kim Minute was sitting on the bench beside him, not playing, just sitting. And when Seoha hit a wrong note and made a face, Kim Minute made the same face, in perfect mirroring, and Seoha looked up and laughed. Clara stood in the doorway that time. And she was the one watching. Her phone rang at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and she was already half awake in a way that her body had learned to remain since she'd started sleeping lighter, attuned to the particular frequency of things going wrong. It was Mrs. Yoon's number. She answered before the second ring. "He is asking for you." The older woman's voice was low, professional, but had something underneath it that Clara read immediately. "Seoha. He woke from a nightmare and he won't settle. He keeps saying your name. I think." "I'm coming," Clara said. She was already pulling on her coat. The drive took 14 minutes. The lobby recognized her now. The night guard nodded her through. The elevator key was in her medical bag, where it had been placed 3 weeks ago without discussion, with the quiet permanence of something that had simply become true. She heard him before she reached the room. Not crying, something quieter than crying, and therefore harder. A thin, exhausted sound, like a child who had already done most of the grief alone and was now just running on empty. She went in and sat on the edge of his bed and put her hand against his back and said, "I'm here. I've got you. It's over." And gradually, the sound stopped. She rubbed slow circles between his shoulder blades and hummed something without a name until his breathing evened out. She didn't know Kim Minute was in the doorway until Seoha was fully asleep. She came out into the corridor and pulled the door mostly closed, and Kim Minute was standing there in a white shirt and dark trousers, arms at his sides, none of the composed formality of the daytime version of himself. He looked like a man who had heard his child suffering and had come and then not known what to do with his own hands. "He didn't call for me," he said. Very quietly. Clara looked at him carefully. "He will," she said. "Give him time." Kim Minute pressed the heel of his hand briefly against his forehead. "How do you do it?" he said. "Just walk in and know exactly what he needs. I am 20 feet away every night and I don't." He stopped. Clara leaned her shoulder against the wall. "It's not a special skill," she said. "It's just showing up. Consistently. In the same way, every time, until they believe you're going to keep doing it." She paused. "You've spent 3 years making sure nobody could get past a certain point with you. Including him." Including everyone? Yes. He looked at her then, really looked, the way he had in the cafe, but without the calculation this time, without the assessment. Something underneath the architecture. Something that had been watching her from doorways for weeks and was only now standing in the open. I built the walls after Ji-un died, he said. I told myself it was strength. That it was protection. A long pause. I think I was just afraid that if I let anyone close enough to matter, I would have to survive losing them. And I didn't think I could do that again. Clara was quiet for a long moment. The corridor was very still. That's honest, she said finally. I'm trying something different, he said. She held his gaze. And this time, she was the one who didn't look. It happened on a Wednesday, which was somehow always the day that things happened. The middle of the week, the hour when defenses were lowest and routines had created blind spots. Clara was helping Seoha with a school project at the dining table when the sound came. Not an explosion, nothing as dramatic as that, but the particular quality of rapid movement below them, the muffled percussion of doors and voices carrying up through floors of concrete and steel. Mrs. Yoon appeared in the doorway with a face that was composed but had gone several shades paler, and she said something in Korean that Clara didn't catch. What she caught was the way Seoha's body went rigid. Not with surprise. With memory. Come here, Clara said immediately, and pulled him from his chair. Mrs. Yoon, where? The older woman led them quickly to the interior room, the one without windows, the one lined with shelving, that Clara had initially assumed was a large closet. There was a lock on the inside. Clara had clocked that on day one, and had hoped she would never need to know why. She pressed Seoha into the corner behind her and told him to put his hands over his ears and think about the pigeons. He pressed his face into her arm instead, and she let him. She didn't know how long they were in there. Long enough for her heartbeat to calibrate itself into something steadier. Long enough for her to feel his breathing slow against her side as she kept one arm wrapped around him and kept her voice a low, continuous hum. She told him about the hospital where she had worked before this city, the one with the rooftop garden where the nurses used to eat lunch on good days. She told him about learning to drive in her aunt's car on a dirt road in Georgia, hitting the same mailbox twice. She talked, steady and unhurried, because her voice was the only thing she could control in that room, and she gave him every steady piece of it she had. When the lock turned from the outside, Clara was already on her feet. Kim Minute came through the door and took in the scene in the space of a single second. Clara in front of Seoha, her body angled between the boy and the door, her chin lifted. Whatever he had been in the corridor before reaching this room, he set it down when he saw them. He crossed the room in 3 steps and dropped to his knees in front of his son. Seoha. His voice was wrecked at the edges. Look at me. Seoha looked at him. And then, and Clara would hold this moment carefully for the rest of her life, the boy reached out and grabbed a fistful of his father's shirt, and Kim Minute pulled him in and held on. Clara looked at the wall and gave them the privacy of it. When Kim Minute stood, finally, with Seoha still attached to his side, he looked at Clara across the room. And in his expression was something she recognized from the corridor on the fever night, that same unguarded openness, but amplified now, unmistakable, too large to be contained within the architecture of walls he'd spent 3 years building. You protected him, he said. Of course I did. He took 2 steps toward her and then stopped, and she thought he was going to say something careful, something measured, something Kim Minute, and instead he simply reached out and covered her hand with his. Just that. His hand over hers, warm and deliberate and asking nothing. Thank you, he said, does not begin. Then don't begin with that, she said. He looked at her. And something in the great, cold architecture of him cracked open. Quiet as snow falling, permanent as spring. October came in gently, the way it did in the years when summer held on just long enough to make you grateful for the letting go. The kitchen was warm. Clara was making tea and Seoha was at the island with his homework spread out in front of him and his sneakers on the wrong feet, which she had noticed and decided not to mention for another 20 minutes because he was deep in concentration and the wrong-footed walk was genuinely charming. His drawings covered the section of wall between the refrigerator and the window, an entire exhibition of months, pigeons, and houses and figures with very round heads, and one that was simply the word Clara in enormous uneven letters that Mrs. Yoon had quietly framed and hung at the center. Kim Minute came in from the corridor in a grey sweater and no coat, no phone visible, no bearing of the man who had once walked into a cafe and lowered the temperature of a room, and went to the kettle and poured himself a cup of water and then came and stood beside her at the counter with the ease of a man who had forgotten to be separate from this. He had stepped back from the organization in August. Clara had not asked him to. She had not asked him anything, she had simply been present, consistent, hers, and somewhere in the accumulation of Thursdays and piano benches and corridor conversations at midnight, he had looked at everything he was holding and decided what was worth the wait. He had told her, on a Sunday morning in September, over coffee on the floor because neither of them had moved to the actual furniture. I spent 10 years building something that could survive without warmth. I didn't know that was its flaw. She had looked at him over the rim of her cup and said, "It took me about 4 minutes in that cafe to figure out you were worth the trouble." He had laughed then, and it had the same quality as the first time she'd seen Seoha laugh. Surprised, a little unsteady, like something returning from a long distance. Now she watched him reach over and look at Seoha's homework worksheet, pointing at number 7, which was apparently still a recurring villain, and heard Seoha groan dramatically and say, "Why is it always 7? And Kim Minute said, perfectly seriously, 7 is simply a difficult number. It is not your fault. And Seoha laughed and the kitchen held it like something precious. Clara looked at both of them. The tea steamed in her hands. Outside, the October sky was going amber at the edges, the city settling into the early dark, and in here the lights were warm and the window was fogged slightly at the corners and there were sneakers on the wrong feet and homework on the counter and love, actual love, settled into the ordinary architecture of an ordinary evening. She had almost not stopped. That January Saturday, in the snow, with her feet moving forward and her head down, she had almost kept walking. She thought about that sometimes. About how close the whole thing had come to not happening. About how a child's small, barely heard sound had turned her head at exactly the right angle. She thought, some detours are destinations. She thought, some fountains you pull people out of and they save you right back. Seoha looked up from his worksheet and said, "Clara, is the tea almost ready?" "Almost," she said. "Okay." He went back to number 7. "Can we have the biscuits too?" "We can have the biscuits too," she said. Kim Minute looked across at her, over the steam and the homework and the warm ordinary evening, and his expression was everything that walls, when they finally come down, reveal, not emptiness. Not ruin. Just a man standing in his own life, finally, with both hands open. And the kitchen was warm on both sides. The biscuits were the ones from the tin Mrs. Yoon kept on the second shelf, shortbread, slightly too sweet, the kind Seoha had pointed at wordlessly 3 months ago until Clara had simply taken the tin down and opened it and placed it in front of him without ceremony, because that was how you taught a child that wanting things was permitted. Now he reached for them without asking, which was the whole victory, right there in that small, automatic gesture. Kim Minute poured his own tea. Set the kettle back. And then, without announcement, he moved to stand beside Clara at the window instead of across from her. Beside her, shoulder almost touching shoulder, and looked out at the October city the same way she was looking at it. Like two people watching the same thing and no longer needing to explain why. "Seoha has a recital next Friday," he said. "The piano piece. The short one." "I know. He's been practicing the ending wrong for a week and doesn't want to be corrected." Kim Minute glanced at her sideways. "Should we tell him?" "I'll tell him Thursday," she said. Give him one good day of thinking he has it. He made a small sound, the sound that had replaced the shadow of a smile, the real one, the one she'd been the first to find. You're very strategic for someone who works in healing. Healing is strategic, she said. You find the thing that's broken and you protect it long enough for it to remember how to hold itself together. He was quiet at that. She felt him take it in the way he took everything she said now, carefully, fully, with the attention of a man who had spent years rationing his listening and was making up for it. Clara. I need to tell you something. She turned from the window to look at him. He was already looking at her, had been, she suspected, for longer than the conversation. The night in the cafe, he said, when you told my men to step back. I had been in that car for 11 minutes watching through the window before I came inside. He paused. I needed to see who you were before I walked in. I needed to know whether you were, he searched for the word, calculating something. And you hadn't looked up once, he said. Not at the exits, not at the men, not at the windows. Only at him. His jaw moved. I had not seen anyone look at my son like he was the only thing in the room in 3 years. Clara held his gaze. You came in anyway, she said. Yes. Even though I told your men to be quiet. Because you told my men to be quiet. Something moved in his expression, warm and certain and entirely ungoverned. I had forgotten what it looked like. Someone choosing a person. Not a position. Not an advantage. He exhaled slowly. Just, a person. The kitchen was so quiet she could hear Seoha's pencil on the worksheet. The city outside had gone full amber now, the last of the daylight surrendering to the early dark of October, and the window was warm against the cool of the glass, and she was standing in a kitchen that had been made into a home one Thursday at a time, one biscuit tin and one cup of coffee and one number 7 at a time. Kim Minute, she said. Yes. You're doing it again. He raised an eyebrow. Doing what? Standing next to something you want, she said, and waiting for permission that nobody's making you wait for. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. And then Kim Minute, who had walked into rooms and changed the temperature of them, who had built walls from grief and called them strength, who had once stood in a doorway watching his son laugh like a man observing someone else's life, lifted his hand and very carefully, very deliberately, tucked a loose edge of her hair back beneath the navy beanie she still wore like a habit from that January Saturday, and left his hand there at her jaw. No more waiting, he said quietly. From the island, without looking up from his worksheet, Seoha said, Can we have more biscuits? Clara laughed, the full one, the real one, and Kim Min's mouth curved into the smile that was no longer a shadow of anything, and he reached across and slid the tin toward his son, and Seoha took 2 and went back to number 7, and nobody said anything else for a while. They didn't need to. The kitchen was warm. The city was amber and settling. There were sneakers on the wrong feet and shortbread on the counter and a drawing on the wall that said Clara in letters too big to be contained, which was, she thought, exactly right. She had almost not stopped. She had stopped. And the life that had been waiting, frozen and afraid and gripping the stone edge of a fountain in the January snow, that life had thawed. Slowly, the way real things thaw. The way trust comes back. The way fathers learn to stay in rooms. The way children unlearn silence. The way love, when it is the right kind, does not announce itself. It simply one day fills the kitchen on both sides, and you look around, and you realize it has been building for months, brick by quiet brick, in every cup of coffee learned and every Thursday stayed for and every fever night answered. And it was enough. More than enough. It was everything. And just like that, Clara, Seoha, and Kim Minute found their way to each other. From a freezing fountain in the middle of a January snowstorm, to a warm kitchen in October, to a life that none of them planned, but every single one of them needed. That is the power of one decision. One moment of choosing to stop when everything in you says keep walking. One act of showing up, consistently, quietly, without asking for anything in return, that changes the entire direction of a story. Clara didn't save a boy that day. She saved a whole family. And maybe, just maybe, they saved her right back. If this story touched your heart, I need you to do 3 things for me right now. First, hit that like button. It takes 1 second and it tells me that this story was worth every word. Medium dark skin tone thumbs up sign. Second, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss when the next chapter drops. This community is growing every single day and I do not want you to miss what is coming next. Bell. Third, and this one is my favorite, drop a comment right now and tell me where in the world you are watching from. Your city, your country, wherever you are reading these words tonight. I personally read every single comment and I will say hello back to you, because knowing how far this story has traveled, from this screen to your heart, means everything to me. To everyone who has been here from chapter 1, thank you. You showed up for Clara when she was running through the snow. You showed up for Seoha when he was learning that wanting things was allowed. You showed up for Kim Minute when he was standing in doorways afraid to walk in. You showed up. And that is not a small thing. Now before you go, the next story is already coming. And I promise you, it is going to pull you in from the very first line. So make sure you are subscribed, make sure that bell is on, and make sure you are ready. Until then, stay warm, stay kind, and never walk past a fountain without looking twice.